Hi, welcome to the Wavy Digital Desk. Today I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Susan McMahon about violence against educators. She's joining us from DePaul University. She's the Vincent DePaul Professor in Psychology and Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Programs at DePaul University. She's the chair of the American Psychological Association's Task Force on Violence Against Educators and School Personnel. So I'm just going to bring her in. Dr. McMahon, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a really timely and relevant topic, in our community right now. But as we'll talk about, it is a widespread issue that has been going on for years, as sort of example by your study, and we can get into some of those specific instances as we go. But first, would you mind just talking a bit about how you got involved in this topic and how long you've been taking a look at violence against educators and school personnel?
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here and to share a little bit about the work that I've been doing over the past 15 years. I have been doing work on violence prevention and with urban youth, working with teachers over the past 26 years or so. And I've been working specifically on violence against educators since about 2008, so about 15 years. I was invited to become part of a task force by the American Psychological Association in 2008. And it was then that APA was saying, this looks like it's a problem and there's hardly any research out there and we need to address it. So they pulled together a set of scholars from across the country, and that was led by Dr. Dorothy Espelage, who's now at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And this group of us got together initially and looked at the research that was available, which was very little. And then we made some resources available to teachers, and we really focused on teachers. And we decided to do a study ourselves to say what's happening across the country, given there were few studies. So we surveyed a little over 3,000 teachers at the time in 2010. And at that time, it was a pretty significant issue. And, in our survey, we found that about 80% of the teachers who responded to the survey had reported some type of violence or aggression against them in the current or previous year. So those are pretty high rates. And we've been learning about their responses over the past really, sort of dozen or so years. We asked them about, sort of their schools, their climate, both their individual demographic information as well as their school settings, what kinds of things led to violence, and, what was their worst experiences with violence, what happened with that. And we were actually presenting at an American Psychological Association conference in 2019 on some of this work. And as we were talking, we were realizing there's really a need for a new task force to build upon what we learned from the first one, expand it, and then take the next step. So I would say the research in this area has grown over the past 15 years. So that's good. There's like sort of more acknowledgement about that this as an issue. Previously, really the focus had been primarily on students, which is of course very, very important. We need to understand what's happening with students, and both as offending,
Right.
committing acts of violence or aggression, as well as being victims or experiencing those things. But what was really left out of the equation was the teachers, and the school staff and the educators and the administrators. And so any program that we're going to be doing, we really need to be including their voices, their experiences, because they're also very influenced. And of course, this has kind of escalated with more and more things happening in schools and it becoming recognized. So in 2019, we created a new task force. Some original members are on it, some new members. And we went beyond just teachers. Our first study was just on teachers, and we decided that, we need to hear more voices, because the teachers in our original study also talked about, the administration and what, a lot of times with being frustrated with not enough support, being blamed or, sort of, and we also sort of looked at not just student offenders, but also what about parents as offenders? What about colleagues as offenders? And what about, administrators as offenders? So, and what we find is that, student violence and aggression is the highest. They have the highest rates, but there's actually pretty significant rates across all these other offenders too. So it is, it's a workplace that has all kinds of violence and aggression going on, as many other workplaces do. But it is unique in certain ways because of the student population. So in our new task force, our approach was really to say, we want to survey across the country, and we want to look at educators, school psychologists, school social workers, staff, and administrators. And we surveyed across all 50 states, and we had about close to 15,000 participants. And this was, sort of during COVID. We were about ready to launch the survey when COVID hit, and then we had to
Right, that changes the dynamics of the classroom and everything. So
it did. And so what we decided to do was to build COVID into the assessment, to sort of say, what's happening during COVID, what happened before COVID. So this survey was initially administered in 2020 to 2021. Again, 14,966 participants. The sample was about 81% female, and which is, and about 77% white, which is pretty close to the demographics of our educational staff and teachers. And then, we sort of made some modifications, but we also did a second wave of data collection last spring from, so in, April to June of 2022. And now we're actually gearing up to do a third wave in the spring of 2023, so that we can look kind of across time as to what some of these patterns are. So that's kind of a brief history. I guess the other piece that this new task force has approached the issues is to really have a policy focus. So we really said, okay, we want to make a difference. We want to escalate the data and the findings to sort of say, how can we affect policy to improve things across the country? And so we advocated for various different legislative bills and policies to be approved, and had a congressional briefing last March. So that's just kind of in a nutshell, like sort of a little bit of the history of the first task force, as well as kind of some of the current work that we're in the midst of.
absolutely. Thank you for giving us that, I know it was a brief look, but the overview, because I think that's important in sort of looking at your data and sort of taking different outcomes from it and seeing what you can do about it now. I think for, people viewing, the first thing I just sort of wanted to bring up is, who are the aggressors, and then what examples of violence, like what can that look like? I know that we talked about, it can be physical, but it also can be verbal. And there are a wide range of aggressors. As you said, it's not just students. There are other people that are aggressors, and there are other people besides teachers that can, that do receive those, forms of violence or harassment. So could you just talk to us a little bit about, who are those aggressors?
Yeah, so we looked across 4 different types of aggressors. So we looked at student offenders, parent offenders, colleague offenders, and administrator offenders. Mm-hmm. So, and that was for kind of the teachers, the school psychologists, school social workers, and staff. And then when we looked at administrators, we also sort of said, what's going on in your school, and we have, some pretty interesting kind of findings. We looked across 3 different types of violence and aggression. One which we're kind of calling verbal or threatening victimization, and that includes obscene remarks, intimidation, verbal threats or attacks, bullying, cyberbullying, public humiliation, sexual harassment. Then we also looked at teacher physical, we looked at physical victimization, which includes objects thrown, weapon use, physical attacks. And then we also looked at property violence, like having things, sort of stolen or damaged. And so that's kind of the some of the types, and you really see, you really see all of the offenders with all of the different types. So when you start looking at more physical kinds of things, there's a bigger differentiation with students having higher rates. But again, you sort of, it's a pretty significant problem, not just for students.
Sure, right.
Yeah.
And then, one thing I did want to ask too is another part of your study is looking at how many teachers want to stay in the workforce and how many are turned off by this and do not want to stay in the field any longer. And not just teachers, this is also school administrators and other personnel. Can you talk to us a little bit about that finding? Because I know I did find that really interesting that, we're now seeing with the teacher shortage as well, people wanting to leave the field.
Absolutely. So we asked several questions about whether people sort of wanted to transfer to a different school or position, and whether they wanted to whether they wanted to quit the profession. And the findings are pretty notable and somewhat consistent with some of the other findings that are happening in the field too. So for teachers, during COVID, in our first assessment, we had 49% of the teachers who responded to the survey said they agreed with the idea that they wanted to or planned to quit or transfer. So that's pretty high. And then we actually, in the second wave last spring, it went up to 59%. So it was a problem during COVID, and it's now an even greater problem. So, the questions were also specifically related to concerns around safety in the school and school climate. So it wasn't just like, because you could think about all kinds of reasons why people might want to quit or transfer in terms of support and workload and all kinds of things. But and again, we sort of found that it wasn't just the teachers, but we had rates, if you look across time with the staff, the psychologists and social workers and the administrators, all the rates are between 28 and 44% for both waves, sort of both times that we assessed people. So they went up from, for the psychologists and social workers, it went from 34% during COVID to 44% a year later. And we're still, in that COVID space, but it looks a little bit different in schools.
Right. And I imagine, that number probably will become greater as the workforce declines and then there's more pressure, in certain schools. And I know that's one of those things that you all in your sort of focus on policy are trying to focus on funding, to get the proper, whether it's resources or funding for more teachers, because that is going to, it looks to be based on like your data to affect, how many people are going to stay in the field.
Yeah, I think it's a really big problem. And these shortages, of course, also make it worse for the people who are there.
Right.
So, and if you have then larger class sizes, and, one of the things that can also happen is that when you have sort of assessments needed for students with disabilities or, severe emotional behavioral disorders, and if there's a long lag time because those services, before the assessment, and then in the meantime, there's not good services for them. And then that's kind of creating a problem for the entire school. So I expect that it will continue to get worse unless we really overhaul things. Now, there is funding available. A lot of the policies that we were advocating for in the legislative action, there was money that went through that was approved in the last cycle. So that's not everything, but there's sort of ongoing advocacy happening. But there was sort of they did have the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which they funded $2.3 billion over 5 years for a few of the different legislative things around student support and academic enrichment, safe and supportive schools, national initiatives, some of those kinds of things.
Right. And we'll see how those are sort of hopefully implemented, within the different school systems nationally.
Yeah, I think one of the keys is to be really strategic and thoughtful about it. So you can't just throw, it's like we need resources, but you can't just throw them out there and not really think in a coordinated sort of strategic approach. So we don't, we need to have good assessment. We need to have, programs that have been validated. Now, one of the things is there's been a lot of research on violence prevention, and, sort of whole school initiatives. There haven't been hardly any interventions developed to really sort of include educators. So that's an area for development for researchers, but also for, the schools, so we need to be able to include their voices and also their experiences. So that's something to keep in mind as, and also their well-being, sort of having, it's like, some of the things that are happening are pretty horrendous, and they of course have terrible effects on their, mental health and well-being.
Sure. I mean, they're in charge of so much safety and their students, and they're in charge of so much during the day and so much protection that, you've talked about in your study too, in preparation, are they actually prepared for some of these events to occur? Or are they prepared for the mental, ramifications afterwards? And you talk about the panel in the study too about, what are ways that we can, afford sort of care for the staff. And I think that's really important and interesting, and, a very much larger conversation about mental health across a lot of different companies and people right now, that teachers don't have those resources potentially, also probably because of another shortage, in schools.
Yeah, there's problems in terms of, like, there's so much that we can do, and we do understand a lot about what some of the needs are. In our survey, we actually asked about what, whether they need training in about 18 different strategies, and we looked at the top 5 across all of the different people who responded to the survey. And I can just tell you what those top 5 are: social emotional learning approaches, trauma informed practices, restorative justice practices, working with diverse groups, and de-escalation strategies. So, they're telling us they don't have enough training in this. And you can think about this both in terms of pre-service, like what are we doing in higher education institutions? How are we preparing our educators and staff and, all of our, and administrative leaders? How are we preparing them? And then also, some pre-service as well as in-service training, because they're saying they don't have enough skills and enough training to deal with these things. So we know what a lot of the problems are, but we really need to improve our training. That's one factor that I think is pretty big.
And I have another question, about some of the ways that we can sort of mitigate or possibly help some of the problems of violence against educators. But one thing I did want to mention is I did think it was really interesting, and you all highlight this, that school staff really had high rates of physical violence as well. And I know you spoke to that group, being included in this, that were sort of previously overlooked in some other studies. But I found this very interesting because, that is sort of a group that, might have to take on a lot of, the mentoring or mental health aspects of kids. Could you just speak to, again, sort of like what group that would be that is seeing the highest evidences of violence?
Well, I don't know that one is higher
Okay.
than others, at least in terms of, like, when we look across different groups, it's like something that you might want to, kind of disentangle.
Mm-hmm.
When is it happening, in what context, and what, because you can also think about developmental level, sort of what about elementary schools compared
Right.
to middle schools, compared to high schools. Those things look kind of different, and verbal and threatening kinds of violence have different rates than physical aggression. Like, physical aggression tends to
Sure.
be higher in elementary schools, and verbal and threatening increases a little bit more in high schools, but middle schools can have some of the, the most violence and aggression in their schools. So, and then you sort of look at, well, what about staff? And it's a group that's really been pretty unexamined. So,
Mm-hmm.
as we started to do this work 15 years ago on teachers, it became like more work has been done on teachers, and there are so many teachers, but the staff have been really kind of unexamined. But I think, we haven't yet been able to dive into, okay, well, what staff and what roles, and you're also going to have probably more diversity in training in terms of the staff, and what kinds of roles are they in the schools, and then to really dig into that. But I think one of the interesting things of this study is that we really were able to sort of look across these different stakeholders and realize this is a problem for the entire school. So we need to have an ecological approach in both in terms of understanding the issues and not just pull out one group or another, but also to consider that in our interventions and in our approaches to sort of take into account all of those voices and experiences.
And that leads us, I think, into saying, you did talk about the funding, you talked about the policy, but are there any tangible examples that you all sort of developed or, gave as possible solutions or ways to sort of mitigate violence?
Well, I think that there's all kinds of things, like we could probably be here for another hour to talk about that. But as we sort of think about establishing mental health programs for educators and school personnel, increasing the number of well-prepared educators to address student needs, developing and sustaining positive school and classroom climates, reinforcing connections between students and between students and educators, and also with parents. Sort of building on those things and training on the impact of trauma on children's health and development. So including educators and voices in decision making. So, school and district leaders involving their educators and personnel in those discussions around school practices and discipline, placement, staffing, school climate. So those are a few things, providing comprehensive, coordinated, evidence-based programs and training.
Right. So a lot of it does have to do with getting this sort of, teacher-focused work going like within the community. So getting the opinions of the people actually in schools to sort of incorporate, different things that work for them. I know every school district's going to be different. Every school district's going to have different problems, but, when you speak to like throwing resources out and then having people sort of use them in a very specific way, is that sort of teacher or personnel focus really important to you all in your findings that, they should be a part of the discussion, for administrative practices?
Absolutely. And administrative leaders, they make it, they make a difference. Really a lot of times they have policies that are not very effective or not consistently followed. And sometimes they really move to very exclusionary discipline policies. And what the research suggests is those approaches aren't very effective. So if you sort of think more about a strengths-based approach and trying to build up the positive aspects within the schools and the training and the supports, and being able to address those challenging behaviors when they arise, mediation, de-escalation, and including their voices. And, I think there's a number of things to do practically often teachers have told us too, they don't feel respected, societally, it's like, it's not, and that kind of trickles down into how people treat them and how they feel in their position. So I think there's a lot that we can do. So once recognizing this, even parents, when they're interfacing with educators at the school, to recognize like sort of all the other things they're dealing with and sort of guide your approach when you are, working with a teacher or someone at the school related to your child. So trying to have, sort of an understanding of what the other side might look like.
In that respect, portion I think is interesting because in a video that you sort of were talking about your study, I think one of the things that you pointed out was teachers felt even more upset when they didn't have that support from administrators, following the acts of victimization, whatever, category that might have been in. But I thought that was very interesting because, teachers face some problems and then they would complain about them or maybe try to find ways to fix them, and then maybe the administrators would not be as helpful with continuing that or finding out solutions to sort of mitigate whether it was a problem with a student or a parent. But I think that was a very interesting portion of the study. If that was a question, I'm not sure.
That came out of our qualitative analysis of like their open-ended responses about telling us about this terrible thing that happened. And it was true in a large, a relatively sizable proportion of the responses where where they would describe this terrible thing that happened where, they were hit or kicked or punched or, threatened. And then they, sort of approached their administration with it. And then that was even like the administrator's response was even worse than the original incident, just like you said. So it could be that, they felt blamed, they weren't believed, nothing happened, there was no action. And that was very, very disappointing to them, even more so than dealing with the original incident. Mhm. So that came out naturally. Like, we didn't ask that. That was just them kind of telling what happened and
Wow.
how they thought about what happened. And so, that really speaks to kind of the need for us to work with administrative leaders around their understanding the policies and sort of approaching, sort of working with their staff and how to kind of consistently implement policies so that people can feel safe. I mean, it's one of the most basic things that we all want in our environment, is to feel safe.
Yeah, and I think that that is so important for, as you said, all parts of the school. So, not just the kids, but the people running the school and then the people that are actually teaching the students. I guess that will create, and the last thing I wanted to mention too is you talk about, not letting this impact the next generation of students. So, if they help with these problems now and feeling safe in the classroom, that seems to give a good environment for the next generation of students coming up.
Mhm. Yeah, we need teachers, we need staff, we need people to be in schools. This is like one of the most important jobs we have in our country, is educating our students. So we need to be able to effectively address some of these issues so that students and every school stakeholder can be safe in the school. It's like one of the most basic needs that we all have. So I think there's some very concrete strategies that we can use to make things better, and we should be actively recruiting and training in ways so that people have the tools that they need in order to kind of feel effective in their workplace.
Absolutely. Well, Susan McMahon, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I don't know if you have anything else to add, but I thank you for giving us, so much of your time. I'm sure that we could have talked about this for much longer, but I appreciate you talking about your findings and your research, and thank you for giving us, some ideas of solutions, potentially that you all have presented to the government. So thank you. I think that was really helpful. And, look forward to speaking to you again next time. Unfortunately, I do know that this is sort of a issue that is going to, as your research shows, continue. But hopefully we see those numbers track down at some point as you're gathering, evidence in the different pools.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me to speak about these issues. And the first thing we can do is raise awareness, and the next thing we can do is try to tackle some of these issues.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, and thank you to everyone who's joined. And if you are joining later and you're tuning in, feel free to leave questions in the chat. And if it came up in our conversation, I'll try to point that out. So thank you guys so much, and we'll see you again for the next community chat next Thursday. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.